I made a LinkedIn post recently about a software engineer who I worked with while at Meta, and I described that this engineer came from a tier 2 company. Very quickly, I got a couple comments from people who were offended that I described another company as tier 2. And I can understand that. I think that in today's society, we tie so much of our identity into the jobs that we work. And so by me describing a company as tier 2, it might be interpreted as a judgment on that person, which is certainly not my intention. In this video, I want to explain the main factors that go into the mental model that most people have, including me, about evaluating companies and how that might impact your career. One of the reasons why Blind is so toxic and unpleasant, and frankly, why I created Taro, is because on Blind, there's such a huge emphasis on prestige, on comparison, on compensation in a way that's really unhealthy. There are so many factors that go into a job and the pros and cons of an individual picking a certain job. And so I can understand that it doesn't feel great to describe something as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And certainly that judgment shouldn't extend into the well-intentioned employees who are working there. But here's the thing. People do make tons of judgments about companies. And that means everyone has in their head a categorization of a mediocre, a good, a great company to work at. A good analogy here is kind of like buying a house. Like if you have 2 houses, there's literally hundreds of factors that go into determining which house is a better fit for you. And everything from the location of the house to the quality of the flooring. And so yeah, it's not really fair to say, okay, this house is better than this house, because I'm sure I could find some attribute of this supposedly worse house that is better than the other one. But still, we do make judgments on which house is better. Similarly, when you're applying for a job, you've probably heard this stat that a recruiter or hiring manager will, on average, spend 8 seconds looking at your resume. And so whether that's fair or not, the burden is on you to very quickly talk about your skills and experience and make it relevant to the job that you're applying for. The same principle is true when we talk about where you work. People will inevitably make snap judgments about where you work and the quality of that workplace. This criteria is something that people will generally talk about with their friends, but not in public. So I'm hoping this can be helpful if you're brand new to the industry. When we're talking about a job, there's a ton of criteria that people could care about. For example, compensation, growth, not only how quickly is the company growing, but how quickly can you grow within the company? How stable is the company? The brand recognition, the speed, like how quickly does a company move and ship features? How large is the company? How good is the work-life balance? And location. Where is it located in the world? And there's probably a bunch more criteria as well that I haven't listed. And so, of course, similar to the house example, we can't make a blanket statement that this job is better than this job, but we could go through each dimension and make a judgment there. For example, when I was at Facebook or Meta, they actually had a policy written down where their goal was to pay at 90% of market. So if you consider all the engineers for a certain role, they wanted to be at the 90th percentile. Only 10% of companies should pay higher than Meta. And so that's like a fact, right? So given that information, it is objectively true that Meta will pay more for the same role, for the same engineer, compared to a company like Oracle or some consulting shop, because it is literally in their guideline that their compensation target is to be at 90% of market. Compensation is unique because it is inherently quantifiable and it's easy to make comparisons on that. But if we zoom out, the point I'm trying to make is that there's no correct answer. It's just a question of priorities. What do you care about when you're picking a job? But the fact of the matter is that society is pretty reductive. They're going to remove all the extraneous information, and typically there's agreement that the most important criteria, the 2 most important criteria for any job is money, like compensation, and growth opportunities. That's the lens through which most people are evaluating roles. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Like when you're talking to a hiring manager, a fellow engineer, a venture capitalist, they'll primarily be looking at your past experience, your past roles, and judging them based on, hey, how much were you getting paid? And how quickly were you growing? The other thing worth calling out is that it's literally impossible to have the perfect job. So for example, you can't have very high growth and also a bunch of stability, right? Like presumably if the company is doubling in headcount or your job is changing year over year because you're getting promoted so quickly, then you can't really have that along with a really stable, predictable 9 to 5. In the same way, a company that prioritizes speed and execution, like shipping a lot of features quickly, you can't have that along with a really healthy work-life balance because there's inherently some unpredictability with being able to move quickly. Let's make this more concrete by talking about a software engineer who chose to go work at a freelance agency in Iowa, which is a perfectly reasonable, perfectly good choice to make. This engineer might have family in Iowa, they might really like the cornfields, or they might genuinely enjoy working in a freelance capacity where they get to work on a bunch of different projects in short-term stints in a way that you wouldn't really be able to if you're working at a larger tech company. Again, this is a totally reasonable choice to make, but people will immediately make judgments about this engineer's employer based on it being a freelance agency in Iowa. First, there's not much brand recognition in this role because most people have never heard of a freelance agency, let alone one in Iowa. Second, most people will assume that your compensation isn't that high because unlike most other companies, you likely don't get equity in the business. And if you don't get equity or a significant bonus, it's really hard to have as much compensation in a freelance agency in Iowa compared to a big tech company with stock. And third, because it's not a product-based company which can double or triple in the number of users or revenue year over year, you likely don't have as much growth if you're working at some freelance agency compared to, again, working at a traditional tech company. At the end of the day, any decision you make about where to work is totally fine. Whether that means you're working at a freelance consulting shop or you're at a Series A startup, you're at a legacy big company like IBM or Cisco, or you're at one of these kind of new age big tech companies like Meta or Google. All that is totally valid and people have really good reasons for picking any of them, but I just want you to go in eyes wide open about the decision you're making and how that might be perceived by other people. What I'd recommend doing actually is for all the different opportunities that you're evaluating, literally take a piece of paper and write down how you would rank each of them based on the criteria that we talked about. Compensation, culture, work-life balance, growth opportunity, all the things that you might care about. And then think about what's important to you, what will set you up well for future opportunities. And part of that is frankly, how it'll be perceived by other people, and then make a really deliberate decision. As long as you're aware of what choice you're making and how that might affect you, then I think there is really not a bad answer, but I just want people to be more thoughtful about it. I think the issue in my LinkedIn post that I mentioned at the very beginning is that I made it appear as though I was conferring judgment on the quality of this engineer based on the fact that they came from a tier 2 company, which is certainly not my intention, and I'll be more careful about phrasing that better in the future. The point of this video is I wanted people to be aware of how do most people evaluate companies and how that might impact your own decision-making process. There's a ton of other criteria that could go into picking a job. It's a super complicated decision. I'd love to hear from you what else you consider. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.